I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University, eastwestaccord.com. Very significant news in the Syrian civil war. Within these last hours, it is confirmed that the Syrian army, conjoined with its mercenaries from Hezbollah, Lebanon, and its mercenaries from Iran, also with the complete assistance of the Russian advisors, Russian equipment, and most significantly, Russian air, very, very first-rate Russian helicopters, have retaken the ancient city of Palmyra that fell under the hands of the cutthroats of the Islamic State in May of 2015. That news is so large, we'll explore it in depth, but I mention immediately for those who are concerned, because this is an ancient city filled with archaeology that is the heritage of mankind, and you will recall there was a very famous archaeologist who was brutally murdered by ISIS in a ceremony there where they also blew up the ruins. We now learn that 80% of the archaeology is intact. They're still looking over because the damage is everywhere. It's as if it's been marauders have raided in order to tear the walls down. These cutthroats are both devils and at the same time disrespectful of everyone's traditions. There is also significant news, because we are following the new Cold War, in Ukraine, the Black Sea Basin. There's a NATO conference scheduled for Washington soon enough, and the leaders of the earth will be arriving. Most significantly is Poroshenko, the leader of Ukraine, the Kiev government, the president of Kiev, is said by the Polish minister's office to be meeting with the president of Poland on Friday, April 1st, in Washington. Poland and Ukraine have been cooperating in the prosecution of the war against Donbass for quite some time. Poland is the most outspoken, the most militant of all the Eastern European states once under the Soviet Union, right up against the Russian frontier. I mention that because at the same time there is news, and Steve will discuss it, that the Polish government is in turmoil, searching for a new prime minister. Professor, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. Palmyra is now in the hands of the Syrian army, thanks to the leadership and the bravado of the Russian military, the Kremlin's decision to intervene in the Syrian civil war. This looks like good news. Is it, Steve? Good evening to you.
John, the taking of Palmyra by Syria, the Iranian fighters, and especially considering the role of the Russian air protection and bombing campaign, is a stunning military victory against the Islamic State. Really the first. Stop and think. For 3 years, the United States claimed to be bombing the Islamic State, and the only thing that happened was the Islamic State conquered more territory in Iraq and Syria. In September, last day of September, I think, so about 6 months ago, Putin began an air campaign over Syria, which turned out to be far more sophisticated, by its own admission, than our own Defense Department had ever imagined Russia was capable of. And now they've taken Palmyra, the place of atrocities, place of beheadings, place of the devastation of antiquities, a place of the sexual enslavement of women, but also a major stronghold of the Islamic State, and the byway to, assuming that eventually after they consolidate, the Syrian army, its ground allies, and Russia will continue on to Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State in Syria. So at the moment as we talk, it's a tremendous political victory against the Islamic State. And the fact that it comes after the second major terrorist attack on Europe, Paris, and just recently Brussels, gives it greater resonance. But we can't be sure about the military and political consequences, though they are going to unfold. One thing we can be sure about, because we have it before us, is that the taking of Palmyra brought about a change in the American media and official discourse about Putin's role in Syria. For the last 6 months, all the major newspapers, prompted by NATO statements and Department of Defense statements, the President's statements, the Congress statements, was that Putin's air war in Syria was bad on all counts. It wasn't really against the Islamic State. It was to keep Assad in power in Damascus. Russia was up to some underhanded mission that it wasn't really announcing. It had nothing to do with Russia's fear of international terrorism, its national interest. It was either Putin trying to bolster his sagging ratings at home or his attempt to reconstruct the Soviet Union, all these things. Now that narrative has changed. And for the last 3 or 4 days, most news stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times, which lead the demonization of Putin in this country, have credited the Russian air war in the taking of Palmyra. So this is a step forward toward a recognition of the role Russia already plays and should play in a coalition with the United States, and maybe with NATO, against international terrorism. I have a bit of an ego stake in this, because right after Paris, my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, and I wrote a short editorial called Coalition or Cold War with Russia, where we urged that the United States at last end this Cold War and form a coalition with Russia against international terrorism. It wasn't done. And in fact, I just received from Moscow a bulletin that says as late as March 24th, this is a bulletin from the Russian Foreign Office, NATO was still refusing official cooperation with Russia against international terrorism. So a coalition with Russia, a full one, is a long way off. But the narrative about what Putin has done in Syria and his partial withdrawal, not a meaningful withdrawal in the sense that he can be back in 24 hours and he left a lot behind. But this is extremely important. If this, remember that only a few days ago, General Breedlove, the American commander of NATO, and members of Congress were doing what Obama himself had done in the past, was to rank Russia as a greater threat to American national security than the Islamic State. So there is a subtle but meaningful shift now in how we are discussing things. And I know I could give you one more piece of evidence,
of course,
because I know he's a close friend of yours. Former ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, probably among the 2 or 3 top anti-Putinists in America, is said to have tweeted to the Russian Foreign Office today, "Spasibo, thank you for helping in the liberation of Palmyra." Do we have 10 seconds for another
Yes.
footnote? Also interesting, on the part of these people who had professed to have great concern about human life and the Islamic State, is that in all the news stories, what particularly attracts them and brings some gratitude to the Russians is the fate of the antiquities in Palmyra. As you know, it's a remnant of the Roman Empire. 2,000-year-old antiquities there are priceless, valueless. I mean, there's no value historically that can be put on them, and the Islamic State was destroying them. So much of the gratitude in the American press today goes not to Russia for saving women, saving people from execution, but for saving the antiquities. And so last night, the Hermitage, the greatest museum in Russia, which, and I didn't know this, has a replica of most of the antiquities in Palmyra in its museum, has joined together with other world museums in a campaign to try to restore the damage that the Islamic State had already done in Palmyra. So Russia now emerges, and it's being acknowledged, faintly at least, in the press, as the savior of Palmyra.
I'm speaking with Professor Stephen F. Cohen. We're emphasizing Palmyra to begin with. We're going to continue to explicate what this means, but when we come back, I'm going to report to Steve what I've learned about as recent as the week before the attack on Brussels, how NATO, how the national security leaders of Europe were still aiming their blame at Putin and not at the Islamic State, not at Al-Qaeda, for creating the refugees in Europe. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Professor Cohen is here, and we're discussing the liberation of Palmyra, certainly the archaeology of Palmyra. We are awaiting a report by UNESCO. It's going to take many months to get a full assessment of this. I do note that a Russian archaeologist is quoted saying that the damage done is enormous, but importantly, the symbol of the city, the columns, are intact, and they're assessing Palmyra. However, this is part of the story of blaming Russia for the trouble in Syria, for creating the refugees, for weaponizing the refugees was the charge of General Breedlove in charge of NATO recently. Most important, Steve, in Brussels, the week before the attack on Brussels, the airport and the metro station by the jihadists, the Belgian national jihadists, there was a conference in Brussels, national security conference, about what is to be done. And at that conference, I talked to Josh Rogan of the Bloomberg View. He talked to a president of one of the Baltic states. And the president was saying not only is Russia weaponizing the refugees of Syria and turning them loose on Europe to destabilize the European governments, but also the accusation is made that Russia is pushing the Muslims of Russia across the border into Finland to then become immigrants that weigh on the governance of Western Europe. So it's a double charge of weaponizing Muslim immigrants. There is no possibility, Steve, given that conference that I learned from Josh Rogan, that there's any change of direction whatsoever. Palmyra is not going to change the opinion of NATO and other national security experts in Europe that Russia is the main threat.
This weaponization business was a concept, anti-Putin concept, invented by a professor, a New York City professor, who has since repudiated it as dangerous. It's also meaningless. It's a slur. And there can be no bigger slur on Russia and Putin than the one made by Breedlove, which pumps out of the Baltics, of course. And some of the people you quote are close to these sources and report these things. Then Russia is weaponizing the migration crisis in Europe. Russia is a part of this crisis. It affects Russia directly. Russia already has almost 1.5 million Ukrainian migrants in Russia from the Ukrainian Civil War. It's also true that a growing number of Syrian or Middle Eastern would-be migrants realize that the sea journey to Greece or Italy has just become too dangerous, and there's a land route to Europe through Norway and the Norwegian border with Russia. And that trickle has grown into a larger quantity of would-be refugees. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny aspect of the vast migration crisis that afflicts Europe. For about a year, Russia has sought cooperation with the Norwegian authorities about what Russia should do with it, about it. Should they let them cross into Norway or not? But Russia is bound by international agreements up there. And Norway, as part of the kind of free visa zone of Europe, has been obliged to let them cross the border. And Russia has done so until recently. But to blame Russia for the migration crisis in Europe is simply a slur. It originates with the Baltic states, Poland, and NATO. And the evidence is clear. Long before, and this was 6 months ago, Russia began to bomb in Syria, Europe was already awash with 1 million migrants. The crisis was well underway. Russia is part of the solution of the migration problem. But as you say, according to the Russian Foreign Office, NATO is still unwilling to cooperate with Russia on the terrorism problem, and the migration problem is part of that.
Let me read you the quote, Steve, just to make certain we have everybody organized on the same page. Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves alleges that the migrants hide their status as permanent residents of Russia. The quote, "You've seen several thousand coming from Finland across the Russian-Finnish border. There is something very fishy going on." So the accusation, again, there is no evidence for this. He's asserting something he's not proving, but he's putting it into Bloomberg View, which is global. And at this point, I would say that Europe is way down the road of insisting that Russia is going to remain the threat indefinitely, Steve. This isn't going to accept evidence from Palmyra as reason to reverse the opinion. This is going to see Palmyra as not important. They're going to ignore it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That was actually going to be my next point, but framed as a question. But you've now kind of agitated me, so let me say something impolite. The lies that are on purpose pumped into the information space that come from the Baltic states, from Poland, from Ukraine, and are embedded by NATO, and then pass into American publications. There are so many that at my age, and with all the important things in the world to comment on, I just refuse to stoop to this level of discourse. They are simply assertions that are not true. I saw one the other day that said, and it's akin to what you reported, that Putin is organizing Muslim citizens. Russia has about 18 to 20 million Islamic citizens in the Russian Federation. He's organizing them to migrate to Europe. I mean, this is beyond preposterous. It's beyond. It's simply another blood slur that's part of the demonization of Putin. You don't have to like Putin or admire him to draw a red line over what's admissible in the conversation or isn't. You know what it's equivalent to? It's equivalent to the birther attack on Obama. The charge in this country which persists that Obama's a secret Muslim. This stuff needs to be ruled out. But it frames a very important question.
We're going to continue. Just a moment, Steve. Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University, Russian history emeritus, will come back with the new Cold War and accusations against the Kremlin despite successes. I'm John Batchelor. John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I am discussing with Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University, Princeton University, and eastwestaccord.com the success, aided by Russian air, Russian advisors, Russian equipment, Russian direction, Russian morale, of the Syrian army with its mercenaries from Hezbollah, its mercenaries from Iran, of retaking an ancient global capital, Palmyra, rescuing the people who live there, who are left after the cutthroats have been driven out, and recovering the human, cultural gems that were at risk and being damaged. In fact, they've defaced statues. I mean, the cutthroats are disrespectful of humanity. However, At the same time, I am asserting from my reporting recently that this is not changing NATO's opinion or Europe's opinion of Russia being the problem. General Breedlove makes the accusation that Russia is weaponizing the immigrants of Syria, I suppose by driving them out with bombing campaigns is the accusation. The president of Estonia says that Russia's weaponizing its own immigrants, Russian residents, driving them across the Finnish border. And a representative of Romania in this same reporting from a conference in Brussels the week before the jihadist attack at the airport says that Russia is undermining the governance, the democracies of Europe by using this anti-refugee momentum to empower the right wing. She is speaking as a member of the opposition party in Hungary, where she says that the Hungary's government is being pushed to the right to favor Russia with these refugees. So, Steve, apparently Russia is not only undermining European comity with these refugees, Putin is going to persuade all of the governments that are under these refugee with this refugee crisis to come over to his side of the ledger. This is a very sinister man.
The European Union is in profound crisis. One aspect, only one aspect of the crisis is the growing popularity of far-right parties in Europe. The growing popularity of those far-right parties is the direct result of unwise policies by the people who run the European Union. And it began years ago. That they now care to blame Putin for it is another way of not taking responsibility. You can remember how long ago was it we were talking about the threat that the Greek financial crisis posed to the European Union. Was this Putin's doing? Obviously not.
Well, they had photographs of Putin meeting with the president of Greece. That proved it.
All right. So here's the question. And I think we know the answer. No, we don't know the answer, but here's the question.
It was the prime minister of Greece. Go ahead.
All right. Palmyra is clearly a military turning point against the Islamic State. When Putin began the air campaign on September 30th or October 1, it seemed likely, and this is why he intervened, that the Islamic State would take Damascus. It is not clear that the United States government was actually opposed to that, because one gets the impression from NATO headquarters and from Washington that they have prioritized removing Putin because regime change is on their agenda to defeating the Islamic State.
Or removing Assad. You said Putin.
I mean Putin.
They want to remove Putin?
No, I said let me repeat. They gave the impression, and they give the impression with this talk that you've just reported, which comes not just from irresponsible journalists who are basically...
No, this was a national security conference in Brussels. There's nothing journalists about these. These are the leaders of the countries.
It creeps into the American press. It's reported daily. I mean, these guys act as stenographers. They repeat what these anti-Russian officials, particularly in Eastern Europe, tell them, including the president of Estonia, and they repeat it. But when Obama and Breedlove and the Joint Chiefs of Staff periodically tell us that Putin is a graver danger to the United States than is the Islamic State, and they have done that repeatedly. It's a matter of record. You, John, and I would read that to mean that our priority would be removing Putin over defeating the Islamic State. So when Putin intervened 6 months ago in Syria from the air, the Islamic State appeared to be on its way to Damascus. Now, as a result not only of Palmyra, but of previous victories on the ground by the Syrian army, Iranian fighters, Hezbollah, it's all true, Kurds, but due to Russian air power, now the Islamic State is on the retreat. It's been driven out of one of its strongholds. And as I said before, the Russian-backed war may now be headed toward Raqqa, the capital of...
I have reports.
Now, the question is...
I just want to add this, Professor. I have reports that the Russians are bombing and raiding as well. I'm not certain if that doesn't mean special forces. From the Euphrates Valley, where they're attacking now, where Raqqa is, between Aleppo and the Turkish border. So they're sweeping ahead of the headlines. I also note that the U.S. State Department has warned Americans to get out of southern Turkey. I just mentioned that because Turkey has an army planted at the southern part of Turkey on the Syrian border and is aware of these Russian successes. I also mentioned, Steve, I remind everybody that 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, it might have been 10 days ago, there was a conference in Ankara of all of the anti-Assad forces coming together again to put together one more version of the Free Syrian Army, despite the Russian successes. And this was about the same time Putin announced that he was pulling out some of his air elements from Latakia, though he put in new air elements, and that's what's been assisting Syria. So, Steve, there's a lot of game playing going on within the Syrian civil war. And I have to say, some of it involves Turkey and Moscow and Washington working together to either ignore Russia's successes or reverse Russia's successes. Please continue, Professor.
And why omit Saudi Arabia?
Because I don't have a report on that, and because Saudi Arabia isn't as powerful. Its dollars aren't as powerful as the United States arsenal. That's why I'm mentioning.
I'm referring to its joint preliminary plan with Turkey to invade Syria. I mean, that's been on the books for months. Right. So I think what Putin has done, the Russian army, or the Russian Air Force, with the Syrians on the ground, with the taking of Palmyra, may have reversed that. But let me pose the question that you keep posing, but it's my question, so I want it back.
Right.
Does the military victory, which is also profoundly political, because it changes, or it should change, the narrative about whether Putin is a friend or foe in Syria of the United States. And for me, the evidence is abundantly in, will this now abet more cooperation between Washington and Moscow? Political. This is the question. To answer the question, we have to ask how we got here. And we got here, though it's not acknowledged in the American press, via a kind of détente or coalition forged by John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. Lavrov has been in Moscow, I think, 3 or 4 times in the last year, met with Putin 3 or 4 hours, very recently as well. What we know for sure is that Putin backs this new détente. And it's unfolding most rapidly in Syria, with the Geneva peace discussions for the political transition in Damascus, but also with the Russian-backed victory in Palmyra. So does Palmyra now give impetus to the Kerry-Lavrov détente against, shall we say, the war party, which you've been discussing?
Yes, one more quote, Steve, just to stir you up. This is Senator Jean Shaheen, who also attended that National Security Conference in Brussels 1 week before the terror attack. Her quote, she says Moscow's goal is to create instability in Europe as a means of creating a relative advantage. The quote, whether that's deliberate or inadvertent, Russia still achieves the same outcome. And I think Russia is going to look at agitating wherever they can to create disaffection in Europe. This is the charge of the original Cold War, Steve. This is a red under the table, correct?
She's not alone. Senator Portman of Ohio and Senator Christopher Murphy, a purported Democratic progressive of Connecticut, are pushing through the Senate a bill for hundreds of millions of dollars to sponsor more American anti-Russian propaganda. They won't relent. This is just a couple days ago. The meetings you mentioned in Europe, these gatherings of anti-Russian factions and forces, you missed one. In Lithuania, 400, lots of them Russians living in immigration now, well-known ones, had a conference in Lithuania. And the theme on the table really was how to remove Putin. Again, regime change in Russia is part of this. And by the way, if you want to tease this regime change, which Donald Trump is against, we might mention him later, in this theme out, you could look at what Putin did in Syria is anti-regime change, because the United States had made it clear its policy in Syria was the removal of Assad. And Russia was not going to permit that. Not another regime change, as occurred in Iraq and in Libya, which gave birth to the Islamic State. Putin, was going to keep Assad and his army on the ground in Syria, and he intervened. So you could see Putin, in a way, as the anti-regime change guy. And you will understand then why getting rid of Putin, that is regime change in the Kremlin, is so important to these people.
We have to talk about Kiev, Steve. We can't let it go because there's turmoil in the government at Kiev. Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University, Russian history. EastWestAccord.com is the website. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. There's too many villains. There's too little time. And we have to attend to Kiev, the troubled, ruinous government of Ukraine. What's left of it, it's bankrupt. It has no good direction. It's being propped up by the U.S., and it is now an outpost of the war party. Most importantly, Poroshenko, the president, is headed to Washington, and there's a scheduled meeting with the president of Poland, Duda. What's significant here is not that meeting, which is PR. This is two parts of the most bellicose of the anti-Russian Eastern Europeans. But the fact that the prime ministership is now available and open in Kiev. The prime minister, so far, Yatsenyuk, has been an agent of change for the United States, for Victoria Nuland and the State Department, these many years since the original turmoil in February of 2014. But now there's a new player being mentioned. Her name is Yaresko. She's an American citizen, but momentarily the finance minister of Ukraine. Steve, does Yaresko represent a deepening of the American control of Kiev?
I'm in a feisty mood tonight. I'm going to push back against you to say two quick things before we go to Ukraine. The question was, would this breakthrough at Palmyra advance cooperation between the United States and Russia, including in Ukraine, and the war parties on the march? But one thing that would advance it is that if your president, Obama, would utter one word of congratulations to the Syrian army for taking Palmyra, not a word from him. Instead, he's gone out of his way, as is his habit, to slur Putin twice in public in the last 3 days. Once by calling him not all that dumb. Who refers to another national leader as not all that dumb? And then again yesterday, when he was talking about American journalists, and Obama said of himself, unlike Obama, I don't get to edit articles before they're published. That's untrue on two accounts. Putin doesn't get to edit a lot of articles either, and in fact, the article that Obama was referring to, the much discussed interview with him in the New Yorker about his own foreign policy, clearly was vetted with the White House before it was published. And Obama affirmed this when he said all the quotes were true, they were accurate. How would he have known that if he hadn't seen them before they were published? But Obama's need to slur Putin repeatedly is a major obstacle in turning what happened into Palmyra into a new détente. Now to Ukraine.
Yes, quickly. We've only got a few minutes. Yaresko is the new player. Yatsenyuk is out, but Timoshenko's back in the mix. And what happened to Saakashvili? Can we do it in a few minutes?
How many minutes have we got?
We got 6, 5, 4.
We could do it in 3.
All right.
Saakashvili has disappeared.
Momentarily.
momentarily. Well, he always disappeared.
I'm looking for him on Brooklyn Heights anytime now.
Exactly.
Yeah,
he started out in Georgia, he ended up in
Brooklyn Heights. Now he's
there.
back. Yes, Odessa.
Yeah.
He might be in, and he was feuding
I actually
in
saw
Kiev.
him on his bicycle once.
All right.
Well, all right.
But Yaresko, the new player, Timoshenko, the old player.
All right. Timoshenko, please remember, exemplifies the role of the oligarchs,
Right,
particularly the energy oligarchs in Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union. When she was prime minister, she dealt with Putin and signed all the energy contracts that the American-backed Kiev government today says were unfair. So if Timoshenko becomes the new prime minister, it is affirmation that the oligarchs still run Ukraine. And in case your listeners can't place her, she's the rather handsome blonde woman who wears her hair in these thick, around-the-head braids. She's quite a striking figure, and who was jailed briefly under the previous president. She also, about a year ago, said that the best solution to the Russia problem was to nuke them. So she's not the ideal choice.
and Natalia Yaresko.
This is interesting. I have gotten a lot of grief for saying on your broadcast more than once that Kiev is beginning to look like a colony of the United States. Mm-hmm. Partly because of the role Biden plays there, partly because of the way the American ambassador approves all major decisions. Kiev looks like a colony. It's shameful. And one day, Ukrainians are going to be very unhappy about this. But she's of great interest. She's American-born, worked for the State Department, had her own investment firm here, got in some trouble, native-speaking Ukrainian, was recruited to come to be the finance minister of Ukraine. Poroshenko, the president, has recruited a lot of foreigners to work in Ukraine. He's got an advisory council that includes the former prime minister of Australia. It might include Tony Blair. I can't remember. But you've got a lot of foreigners in very eminent positions of government there. Now, she's a special case. She wants to be prime minister. Yatsenyuk is going. They're trying to keep him in power. The IMF is. But he can't hold a majority in the parliament. Remember, the prime minister has to be approved by the parliament. Though the president can nominate the person, it needs parliamentary backing. So Yatsenyuk seems to be on the rope. Suddenly, Yaresko offers herself. And now she has said, 2 days ago, if I do not become prime minister, I am resigning my position as finance minister, and I am leaving Ukraine, a threat. She is offering instead, and this is extremely important, what she calls a technocratic, non-political government. That if she's prime minister, she will appoint only technocrats to governmental positions. And this will be good for Ukraine. But please stop and think what that means. Members of government are supposed to be elected and approved by Parliament, not by Washington, D.C. and the International Monetary Fund that Washington controls. So if she were to become prime minister and she would appoint this type of government, she would have, from top to bottom, substantively, a non-Ukrainian government. And therefore, the colonization of Ukraine by the West would be complete. Now,
we have about a minute, Steve. What you're saying, it wouldn't be a colony, it would be a think tank in Georgetown.
I like that, but I'm going to stay with colony.
All right.
Because it's a replication of old 19th century, the way the great powers ran their colonies. Something similar happened in Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin, when a swarm of American advisors filled Yeltsin's governmental offices and ministries, wrote the laws, wrote textbooks, tried to draft a Russian political system. What was the result, John?
Collapse of the ruble and chaos in the Caucasus.
Can you put a face on it?
Well, Vladimir Putin appeared.
Thank you, John. Good night. Good night.
Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University, East-West Accord, in an extremely successful humor. I'm John Batchelor.